The late afternoon sun cast its radiant golden light upon the ancient walls of Lancaster Palace, which stood tall as a solemn witness to centuries of history. The last rays of sunlight shimmered on the stone-paved courtyard, stretching the shadows of the guards, transforming them into living monuments of loyalty and discipline. The atmosphere here was both solemn and lively. Tourists from all over the world gathered, some marveling at the palace's grandeur, while others busied themselves capturing unforgettable moments through the lenses of their cameras. Marcus Alden, one of the royal guards, stood motionless in the courtyard, his solid frame clad in the deep crimson uniform trimmed with gold. To the unperceptive, it was merely an elaborate outfit, but to him, it bore the weight of honor, sacrifice, and memories that could never be erased. 35 years old, he had fought in the Middle East 3 times, faced death, pulled wounded comrades from gunfire, and listened to the final words of a friend he could not save. And now he stood here, not for some meaningless ritual, but because he fully understood what it truly meant to be a protector. The summer breeze gently brushed past, stirring the noble plume atop his bearskin hat. Yet Marcus remained unmoved. His eyes, though fixed straight ahead, silently observed everything around him. He noticed a timid little girl peeking from behind her mother's dress, her round eyes filled with curiosity. An elderly couple, their chests adorned with old medals, walked by and gave him a slight nod. Marcus did not return the gesture, but in his heart, he understood, an understanding shared by those who had once fought for something greater than themselves. Not everyone understood that. Among the tourists gathered here, some came with respect, some with curiosity, but there were always those who came merely to mock. And Marcus had grown accustomed to them all. His years on the front lines had taught him that the world was always divided into 2 kinds of people: those who understood respect and those who would never grasp the true value of sacrifice. But today, one of the latter had appeared, and he was about to make a grave mistake. The solemn atmosphere of Lancaster Palace was shattered by loud laughter, a jarring note of discord in the midst of its dignified symphony. Kieran Hartwell, 19 years old, entered with an appearance that anyone could recognize at a glance. A boy who had been excessively pampered. A Versace silk shirt, a gleaming Rolex on his wrist, pristine Italian leather shoes that had never touched anything but the spotless floors of luxury hotels. Standing amidst the crowd, he was an anomaly, belonging to an entirely different world. A world where money dictated a person's worth, where power did not come from discipline, but from the influence his family had bought for him. But Kieran was not here to show respect. He glanced around, arms crossed over his chest, his sharp blue eyes brimming with boredom and disdain. "What a joke," Kieran declared, deliberately raising his voice so those around him could hear. "Standing like statues all day, and they call this being a soldier? Nothing more than puppets in a royal charade." Laughter erupted from his group of friends, a pack of wealthy young men who carried the same air of arrogance, indifference, and outright disregard for anything beyond themselves. Yet among them, one man did not laugh: James Sterling, Kieran's tutor and personal handler. James was not an easily intimidated man, but he knew all too well the reckless mouth of the young master he had been hired to educate. Kieran was not evil, but he knew no fear, no limits, no real consequences. In his world, mistakes did not exist, because no one had ever dared make him pay for one. James stepped forward slightly, his voice laced with concern. "Kieran, perhaps we should show some respect. These soldiers—" But he did not get to finish. "Respect?" Kieran scoffed, eyes flashing with defiance. "For what? Standing still? In my world, those who do nothing worthy of respect are not worth my attention either." James clenched his fists, ready to pull him away, but Kieran's gaze had already locked on a Marcus Alden, the guard who had not moved a single inch, as if he had not heard a word from the insolent young master. And that unsettled Kieran. Marcus Alden did not react. He stood firm, his posture like a carved statue, eyes fixed straight ahead. He had seen plenty of people like Kieran before, children raised in luxury, never knowing real fear, never understanding what it meant to fight for something greater than themselves. His years in the military had taught Marcus that the greatest dangers did not come from those holding weapons on the battlefield, but from those who had never known their own limits. Kieran did not understand that, but he would soon, and Marcus would not need to lift a finger. Kieran would bring the lesson upon himself. Kieran could not stand being ignored. He was used to being the center of attention, to people bowing their heads when he walked past, to unquestioned obedience. But the soldier before him, the one who should have feared him, who should have been offended by his sharp words, did not react. That silence was not fear. It was defiance, and that made Kieran furious. He stepped closer, close enough to see the sunlight glinting off the medals pinned to Marcus's chest. "Hey, are you deaf?" Kieran sneered. "I am talking to you. Or are you really just a mute statue?" No response. The crowd began to murmur. Some shook their heads, while others pulled their children away, unwilling to let them witness such blatant disrespect. But Kieran did not care. He leaned in, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Perhaps you cannot move because you are afraid of me," he murmured, low enough that only Marcus could hear. "Afraid that if you so much as flinch, I will have an excuse to humiliate you?" Marcus still did not move. But now he was not just observing Kieran. He was reading him. Every subtle shift, every breath growing heavier, every tightening of fingers. He had seen this type before, in the military, on the battlefield, in training camps. The kind that needed to prove their strength by tearing others down. The kind that did not understand that true strength was not in aggression, but in control. People like Kieran always sought to provoke others because deep inside, they feared that if they did not, they would be nothing. Marcus saw it in Kieran's eyes, and he knew what was coming next. He was about to lose control. Kieran's hands clenched into fists, then loosened again. He glanced around. People were watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. The anger inside him boiled over, and he decided he would teach this guard a lesson. A fatal mistake. He took a step back, lowering his stance, shifting his weight onto his heels, preparing to launch a kick. One that would never land on Marcus, but would strike directly at his own foolish pride. In Kieran's mind, this kick would be perfect. It would not injure Marcus. He was not foolish enough to actually attack a royal guard in front of hundreds of tourists. No, this kick had only one purpose: to humiliate him. As long as Marcus stepped back even slightly or flinched to avoid it, Kieran would get what he wanted: a victory, a crack in the unshakable composure of the royal guard. For 19 years of his life, he had never lost a confrontation. Not because he was better than anyone, but because no one had ever dared to stand against him. But this time, reality did not unfold according to Kieran's plan. As his foot swung up, all the factors he had failed to consider exploded at once. Tight jeans restricted his flexibility. Poor stance threw off his balance. The royal courtyard stone pavement was nothing like the smooth wooden floors of a gym or tennis court. His anger dulled his muscle control. When the kick was unleashed, it was not the impressive, intimidating strike he had imagined. It was a disaster. His foot veered off course from the very first moment, missing Marcus's knee and merely brushing against the edge of his uniform. A touch so light it was meaningless, not even enough to make Marcus shift an inch. But the only thing the kick truly affected was Kieran's own body. His balance was lost. The slick Italian leather of his shoe slid against the hard stone. And then, for what felt like an eternity, Kieran felt his entire body tilt backwards, spiraling out of control. And he fell. Silence blanketed the square like a thick shroud. No laughter. No jeers. Only the sharp impact of Kieran's body crashing onto the cold stone. He landed awkwardly, his leg twisted, his ankle bent at an unnatural angle. A searing pain tore through his consciousness instantly. "Aya!" The scream shattered the heavy atmosphere. He writhed on the ground, clutching his leg, his face pale with agony. This was not temporary embarrassment. This was real pain. For the first time in his life, Kieran felt a pain that no amount of money could erase in an instant. Panic surged through him. His ankle throbbed, and every movement sent pain radiating outward like fire consuming everything in its path. He had seen others collapse, had heard their cries of pain, but he had never thought it could happen to him. James Sterling rushed over, his face drained of color. "Kieran, are you okay?" But Kieran could not answer. The pain was too much. He could only lie there, gasping, his fingers digging into his ankle, tears spilling from his eyes in shock. Meanwhile, Marcus Alden said nothing. He remained in place, his gaze unshaken. He had seen this coming. He had known this would happen. Not because he had some prophetic ability, but because he understood human nature. He had encountered young men like Kieran before, those who had never learned the lesson of limits, of responsibility, of the consequences of their actions. He felt no satisfaction. There was no joy in seeing the one who had mocked him now writhing at his feet. There was only one thought in his mind. Now the boy had learned his first lesson. In his overwhelming pain, Kieran finally realized something terrifying. No one rushed to help him immediately. No one hurried to lift him up. No one rushed to shield him from the consequences of his own actions, as they always had before. The friends who had been laughing earlier now stood frozen, their expressions uncertain, unsure of what to do. The surrounding tourists no longer looked at him as a powerful young man, but as a foolish boy who had just learned a painful lesson in reality. And in that moment he felt exposed. The feeling of someone stripped of all protection, forced to face reality in its harshest form. He looked up at Marcus, the man who still stood exactly where he had been, showing neither pity nor satisfaction. Only calm, steady eyes, those of a soldier who had seen far too many like him before. And that terrified Kieran more than anything else. Not the pain, not the humiliation, but the feeling of being completely laid bare for the first time in his life, realizing that he was not as strong as he had always believed. And then, something no one expected happened. Marcus Alden, the royal guard Kieran had mocked all this time, did something no one could have predicted. When Marcus Alden stepped forward, not a single word was uttered in the crowd. Silence engulfed the space, as if even the air itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen. No one had expected that the soldier Kieran had just insulted, the one he had tried to humiliate, would be the first to kneel down and help him. But Marcus did not hesitate. With the precision of a trained soldier, he knelt in a controlled motion, his rifle still secured firmly on his shoulder, his movements crisp and practiced, as if he had done this hundreds of times before. Because, in reality, he had. The only difference was that those he had helped before were his comrades on the battlefield, not an arrogant young noble who had just tried to kick him a few seconds ago. But to Marcus, that did not matter. Kieran looked up, his eyes still red from pain, but there was something else in them. Confusion. He could not understand. Why? He had just insulted this man. He had just tried to humiliate him. So, why was he helping him? For the first time in his life, Kieran felt broken in a way he had never experienced before. It was not like being scolded by his father. It was not like being reprimanded by a teacher. It was unlike anything he had ever known. There was no anger, no humiliation, no retaliation. Only absolute composure. And that terrified Kieran more than anything. He did not know how to react. Marcus examined Kieran's ankle with the precision of someone who had done this countless times before. "Stay still," he said, his voice not loud but carrying undeniable authority. "Your ankle is sprained. The ligaments may be damaged, but there are no signs of a fracture." The way he spoke carried no pity, no indifference, but also no unnecessary gentleness. Only professionalism, calmness, and most importantly, responsibility. I do not understand." Kieran stammered, his breath uneven. "Why are you—" Marcus did not look up, still focused on securing Kieran's ankle with a practiced movement. But his voice rang out, steady as a bronze bell. Being a soldier does not mean only knowing how to fight. He removed his sash, part of the uniform he had spent hours perfecting, and used it to stabilize Kieran's ankle. Being a soldier means protecting, whether or not the person deserves to be protected. Another shock struck Kieran. He could not speak, could not argue, could not understand. Why? Why was the man he had just tried to humiliate the first to kneel down and help him? Why, among all the people standing here, was it only Marcus Alden, the man he had mocked, who was willing to step forward? Marcus should have been angry. He should have ignored him, left him there to writhe in pain and humiliation. But he did not. And that was what made Kieran feel utterly useless. The crowd around them stared at the scene, realizing they were witnessing something far more memorable than any royal ceremony. Some turned to each other, whispering words that Kieran could not hear. The children who had previously gazed at the guards in curiosity were now looking at Marcus with a newfound reverence. Even the adults, seasoned travelers who had seen countless royal guard rituals, were beginning to understand something they had never fully grasped before. Soldiers like Marcus were not standing here just for display. They were standing here because they were strong enough to do so, even when mocked, even when provoked, even when insulted, because they were not men who needed to prove anything. Marcus tightened the sash around Kieran's ankle, securing it in place. "You will be fine," he said, "but do not try to stand. The ambulance is on its way." Kieran swallowed dryly. I wanted to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Marcus no longer looked at him. He stood up, his movements smooth, never once losing his composure. But before he left, he said one last thing, a sentence that Kieran would remember for the rest of his life. True strength is not about making others bow before you. It is about knowing when to kneel to help someone else. Then he returned to his post, standing tall as if nothing had ever happened. Kieran watched him, and for the first time in his life he felt small, not in a way that made him angry, not in a way that made him want to retaliate, but in a way he could not deny. He had been wrong, and for the first time, he truly knew it. The wail of the ambulance siren pierced through the silence. But what truly echoed in Kieran's mind at that moment was not that sound. It was Marcus Alden's words. True strength does not lie in making others bow before you. It lies in knowing when to bow down to help someone else. He had never heard a sentence so simple yet so sharp. That statement felt like an invisible blade cutting straight through his pride, forcing him to confront the truth. He had never truly understood what real strength was. He had been wrong. He had always believed that strength was about being revered, being feared, about having the power to make others obey. But Marcus, that man did not need anyone to bow before him. He did not need to assert dominance, nor did he seek recognition from anyone. He stood firm, like an unshakable wall, never needing to prove anything to anyone. And that was precisely what made Kieran feel utterly overwhelmed. The ambulance came to a stop. The paramedics quickly stepped out, and one of them knelt down to examine Kieran's ankle. "Definitely a sprain, possibly some ligament damage," one of them said in a professional tone. "But nothing serious. You just need to keep it stabilized and rest for a few weeks." James Sterling, his tutor, who had been standing beside him with a tense expression, nodded repeatedly, as if finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. But Kieran no longer cared about his ankle. His eyes remained locked onto Marcus. He was still standing there, posture straight, gaze fixed ahead as if nothing had happened. No words of mockery, no gloating expression, no satisfaction. And that was what made Kieran feel ashamed to his very core. "Can you stand?" a paramedic asked. Kieran gave a weak nod, but the moment he tried to lift his leg, a sharp pain shot through him, instantly throwing him off balance. And then, a hand extended in front of him, Marcus Alden's hand. Kieran froze. No one told him to do that. No one expected him to. Yet Marcus still held out his hand, as if he had never even considered doing otherwise. The same composure, the same unwavering presence. No hesitation, no contempt. Just a soldier helping an injured person. Kieran stared at that hand. He had never felt so conflicted in his life. Was this another test? A way to make him realize he had lost? No. He knew Marcus was not that kind of person. The truth was, Marcus had never seen this as a competition to begin with. Everything he did was simply carrying out his duty. Not the duty of a guard, but the duty of a man with principles. After a brief moment of hesitation, Kieran reached out and grasped Marcus's hand. And as he was pulled to his feet, for the first time in his life, Kieran Hartwell felt truly small before a real man. As the paramedics helped him into the ambulance, he looked out the window, back toward Marcus. He no longer saw him as just a soldier standing there for display. No longer as a silent statue with no significance. but as someone who had just taught him a lesson he had never learned in his 19 years of life. A lesson on the true worth of a man. James Sterling, who had witnessed everything from start to finish, finally spoke as the ambulance rolled forward. "Are you all right?" he asked. Kieran did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued staring at Marcus before slowly turning away, his gaze falling onto the sash that Marcus had used to secure his injured ankle. A part of the uniform he had once mocked was now aiding in his recovery. A symbol he had once scorned was now the only thing shielding him from pain. He clenched it in his hand, as if holding onto the last shred of his dignity. Then, in a barely audible whisper, "I am sorry," he murmured. No one heard him. No one responded. But he knew that, for the first time in his life, he had spoken those words and truly understood their meaning. As the ambulance left the square, its engine fading into the distance, everything seemed to return to its usual order. But in truth, everything had changed. Not because of a fall, not because of an injury, but because a lesson had been taught and a perspective had been altered. Marcus Alden still stood there, as if nothing had happened. But the way people looked at him now was no longer the same. Gone was the idle curiosity of tourists eager to take photos. Gone was the disdainful gaze of those who judged only by appearances, never seeking to understand the essence. All that remained was genuine respect. There was no need to say it aloud, but everyone knew that today, in this very square, a royal soldier had done more than just perform his duty. He had taught a young man, and all who witnessed it, a lesson about resilience, dignity, and true strength. From the ambulance window, Kieran Hartwell kept his eyes on Marcus. He could not look away from that steadfast figure, a man who did not seek revenge, who felt no need to prove anything, who did not let his pride be wounded by insults. A man who endured humiliation without responding with anger. Instead, he responded with kindness. And that was what truly defeated Kieran. Not the fall, not the physical pain, but the overwhelming contrast between his own behavior and that of the guardsman. Kieran had lost control simply because he was ignored. Marcus remained composed even when mocked. Kieran had tried to disgrace another to prove his strength. Marcus had upheld his dignity even when insulted. Kieran had fallen. Marcus was still standing. And that was the difference between someone who had never faced consequences and someone who understood responsibility. Inside the vehicle, James Sterling finally broke the silence. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, studying Kieran with a thoughtful gaze. Kieran tightened his grip around the sash that Marcus had used to stabilize his ankle. At first, he had seen it as just part of the uniform, a mere accessory of men he once looked down upon. But now, it was the very thing that had helped him stand, both literally and figuratively. And suddenly he understood. Marcus was not weak. He was not just a lifeless statue, as Kieran had once believed. It was his resilience, his character, and his kindness that defined his true strength. Strength did not come from shouting. It did not come from displays of power. It did not come from making others afraid. True strength came from self-control, from patience, from the ability to face insults without losing one's worth. Back in the square, a child tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing toward Marcus. "Mom, that soldier is really strong." The mother smiled and nodded gently. "Yes, my son, but do you know something? He does not need to fight to prove it. His strength does not lie in weapons or authority. It lies in who he is." The child fell silent, as if trying to grasp the meaning of those words. But whether he understood it at that moment or not, one thing was certain. The image of that guardsman was now etched into his mind, leaving behind a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. This story is not just about an arrogant young heir learning a lesson in humility. It is about the difference between power and dignity, between aggression and resilience, between those who demand reverence and those who truly deserve respect. Can you be strong without shouting? Can you remain composed even when insulted? Can you respond to contempt with kindness? If you can, then you are stronger than anyone who tries to trample others with force. Because true strength is not found in how you intimidate others, but in how you control yourself. Remember that.